Welcome to With All Due Respect. This is a podcast for women over 40 who are looking for sane, frank advice about their health and wellness, especially through and after menopause. I'm Amanda Thebe, a personal trainer and nutrition coach, and the author of the best-selling book, Menopocalypse: How I Learned to Thrive During Menopause and How You Can Too. I'd love you to join me every week as I chew the fat with some fab guests on hot topics that directly impact you. I also know the power of conversation is lost, and there's nothing better than sitting down for a natter with your mate and putting the world to rights. And that's exactly what I'll be doing with this podcast. We'll really get to know my guests, warts and all. I've made it my mission to help you by exploding a few myths and presenting you with plain, simple facts. These inspiring conversations will hopefully empower you to be a healthy, strong, resilient bitch, just like me. Before we get started, don't forget to hit subscribe and leave a review, and then visit me at amandathebe.com. And now let's get started on today's show. Hi everyone, welcome back to this week's episode of With All Due Respect. Hi, I'm Amanda Thebe. I am excited today because I have Christine Yu on podcast now. Christine has written a book called Up to Speed, the groundbreaking science of women athletes. She is a sports and health journalist and is using this book to disentangle the myth and gender bias from real science, making the case for new approaches that can help women athletes excel at every stage of life. And that goes all the way from adolescence to adulthood. And she covers the spectrum of our reproductive life from pregnancy, menopause, and beyond. And what we're going to talk about in the show today is we're going to dig into why female athletics hasn't had the research it deserves and how that's changing. So Christine is a pretty well-established journalist, award-winning, and she focuses her work on the intersection of sports science and women athletes. And she has appeared in Outside, the Washington Post, Runner's World. I think we were in the same article in Runner's World this week, actually, Christine, and other publications. She is a lifelong athlete, yoga teacher who loves running, surfing, and skiing, and she lives in Brooklyn, New York. Hello, Christine. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Amanda. Thank you so much for inviting me on.
So we're going to talk about your book today. And I actually should mention that you interviewed me for the book as well. It seems so long ago now, though, doesn't it? When we first spoke.
It feels like multiple lifetimes ago. I feel like I've been working on this book forever. You were probably, I feel like one of the earlier folks that I did speak with, just to talk about your experience, right? And everything that you've gone through. But yeah, I started working on this back in the fall of 2020.
Right, yeah. I actually think that's we did speak 2020. I think that's when I look back when we had our first conversation. And so this is your field of expertise. It's what you always write about. You're athletic, and so you actually have a passion for this too. So when we just start at why you wanted to write the book, where did it come from? What was the impetus for you to do this? Full disclosure, I haven't finished reading the book, but I'm loving what I'm reading so far. I haven't even got to the bit where I'm in it.
Yeah. So
where did it start? Yes.
I think, there's kind of two pieces to answer that question. One was, back in, I think it was 2013 or 2014, I just started freelance writing. And prior to that, I had a running fitness kind of blog. And so I was invited to one of these events hosted by one of these women's magazines, and they had lots of different panels. And so one of the panels, there was a doctor who talked about the female athlete triad, explicitly. And I think that was actually the first time I may have heard that term. I had, growing up, had always heard about, people losing their periods and thinking that was a good thing, right? It meant that you were really fit and in shape, but I never really understood why, right? I was like, well, why would that mean you're in shape? But anyhow, she talked about all these repercussions. She talked about the link between menstrual health and nutrition and bone health. And really what struck me was that, this whole fact about, our prime bone building periods are in our adolescence. And it was just one of those moments where I was like, what are you talking about? That seems like an important piece of information. Why didn't I know about any of this when I was younger? Because I feel like, I don't know, maybe that would have changed how I thought about food and nutrition and, all of these different things. So one, I was just shocked. And also being someone who has been so like interested in this field and someone who studied physiology in college and all this stuff, like, and realizing I didn't know this, I was like, wait, that means a lot of people don't know this.
We don't learn that at all.
At all, right? So that was one piece. And then the other piece of it is, as I started writing more journalism articles, I felt like I kept writing the same thing over and over again. So, writing about the female athlete triad, writing about losing our periods, writing about eating disorders. And each time it was, I'd get a lot of messages from people being like, oh, thank you so much for talking about this. This is really important. Yes, we really need to do something about it. But then it would fade off, right? And then it'd be like another year and it'd be the same thing. It's like, oh my gosh, we really need to do something about this. And it seemed like we kept repeating the same articles over and over again. And I felt frustrated a little bit by that, because I was like, why aren't we actually moving forward in this? But also, why there's got to be some sort of link, right? When we talk about things like, bone stress injuries and losing our periods and knee injuries and body image issues and all of these things. And I really wanted to understand why, right? Like, kind of, what was the interconnecting thread between all of these different issues, and what was keeping us from actually getting better, right? Like doing something about this.
Learning more about it, right?
Yeah.
Instead of just talking. So for anyone who's listening on my podcast that doesn't understand what the female athletic triad is, can we just dig into that a little bit more? And then I also wanted you to talk about, at the end of that, with your ACL experience and how it's not so rare, right?
Yeah. So the female athlete triad, it's this, interconnection between these three different conditions, so looking at, menstrual health, nutrition, or, what folks call energy availability, which I like to think about essentially is like how much gas you have in your tank, right? Like your car. And then bone health, right? So thinking about like how healthy your bones are, how prone you might be to something like osteoporosis. And so what researchers realized was that if your body does not have enough fuel or nutrition on board, not only to support, activities of daily life, but to support like any of your exercise and training, your body's pretty smart, right? It starts to shut down non-essential systems. And so one of those systems is your reproductive system. So that's why your menstrual cycle starts to get a little wonky, irregular, or it might disappear. And the problem with that is that the hormones associated with the menstrual cycle are really important for things like especially bone health, right? It's integral for like building bone, keeping bone healthy, maintaining that bone. So if you don't have that monthly surge of hormones every month, your bone health starts to decrease. And so that's why, in some athletes, even like at a young age, you can see early signs of osteoporosis, which, again, is something we think about, as something only like, oh, in your, 60s and 70s
Old
or whatever.
people.
That have to deal with. But it actually is pretty prevalent in, certain populations of younger athletes.
Yeah. And then I think the same can be said for ligaments and tendons too, right? Because it's really interesting. I remember having a conversation with one of a lead physiotherapists in the US, and she was saying to me, well, she'd actually written a paper on the high number of ACL injuries with female athletes going through puberty.
Yeah.
You had the same experience, no?
Yeah, it's pretty wild, right? So what they often see kind of as girls and boys go through puberty, that injury rate starts to diverge, right? So that's when girls seem to have, be more prone to traumatic knee injuries like ACL tears, and then, going into adulthood. And there's some, thoughts about like how hormones might affect ligament laxity. It might make those ligaments more prone to injury. There's other concerns about how widening hips and all of that can put more stress on the knee. But the short end of the story is that, girls and women can be like 3 to 8 times more prone to an ACL tear, which is a pretty traumatic injury. And so I tore my ACL the first time in college. So I must have been 20, 21 maybe. And I was skiing. It was, just kind of a freak accident. I had a bad fall.
Right.
But then 15 years later, I tore it again, the same knee, when I was running on the track. I was training for a half marathon. I was doing some 400 intervals on the track. And just on my last interval, my knee just seemed to give out, which again, I'm not quite sure what happened. It seems like a very unique way to re-tear one's ACL. And then actually this past winter in February, I tore my ACL in my other knee. So my quote unquote good knee. So
how old are you? How old are you now, Christine?
I just turned 47.
And so that's sort of why I asked that question for anyone listening, because of the exact thing. It's like, sometimes menopause is just described as the reverse puberty, right? And it's just that we don't know for sure, but we're seeing so many more ACL, frozen shoulders. I did my Achilles. It took a year to heal. I've never been injured in my life. And it's the same type of story at each end of our reproductive life that we're hearing, right? So it's and as well as the bone health. I mean, it's the way that it interconnects. And so people have been knowing about this for a long time, and you're continually writing about it and getting bored of writing about it, but it's not reaching the women on the ground, right? And I think that was one of the problems. And even for myself, there was a complete knowledge gap for me, even with working in the industry for decades, about I heard about the teenage sort of incidences of these type of injuries, but now hearing about it from the perimenopausal, menopausal women now, it's like this frustration that if somebody knows about it, why doesn't everybody know about it? Why is it that it seems to be privileged information? Victoria, you talk about Stacey Sims' work, and she's mentioned in the book. I remember her telling me, you need to be doing some more prep work before you do your workouts, because your tendons and your ligaments are a little bit more sort of open for injury. And so, did you come across that yourself, or did you already know about that? Was that a personal experience for you?
Well, I had kind of known about it, I think, in the back of my mind, right? In terms of the injury rate and that's a possibility, right? That these things happen. But I think to your point about what can we actually do about it? And why don't we actually translate that knowledge? I think that's the piece that I was kind of shocked about in a way, and really has been the thing that I, now that I think about it more, that's the piece that I'm really interested in, because, we talked just very briefly before we got on that I was at the Female Athlete Conference in Boston, and it's, essentially a gathering of the who's who in sports science and sports medicine and research around female athlete health. But very consistent, almost in every session, it felt like the same message was we got to figure out this translation gap, right? We got to figure out how to get the science out of the labs and into the hands of coaches, into the hands of educators, athletic trainers, healthcare practitioners, all these different people, right? In order to actually make a difference, because it often feels like it is in very much this bubble, right? We all know this is happening, right? But how do we get it past that? And that's the piece I'm actually really interested in and really curious about. It's what is it that we can do, right, to kind of continue to get this message across? Because, even if we talk about something like female athlete triad, we've known about that since the late 80s, early 90s. And yet it's still this very prevalent issue. It's still this myth, right, about losing your periods. It's something that young girls still hear and still believe, and coaches still believe, right? And so it's why is that? It's been, so many years. Why are we still having this trouble?
And then it's for me, just adding on to that, you were saying, the whole translation piece is that, I've been to these conferences and I've heard people speak, and I'm just you're not looking at every other woman, you're just looking at the athlete. And to me, you need to be looking at the weekend warriors. You need to be looking at the women who are going to the Orange Theory, because that's going to be the lion's share of the ones that are going to be impacted by this. I mean, when we talk about amenorrhea and stuff with high-end athletes, and it almost was like a badge of honor originally. And then looking now at the repercussions of our overall health, it's just shocking that that's even a conversation. So to me, you've got a knowledge gap in the coaching within our school systems, right? That and especially in the US, where athletics in school is such a different beast. And then you've got just translating that down, and how is it applicable to the general population, to the girls that are just now feeling confident going to the gym with their mates and just hanging out, but knowing that there's things that they need to take into account. And then the final part of it is how do we translate the research into pragmatic and practical solutions. I know that you do it in your book. I know that I do it in my book. And it's like trying to just speak in human terms to the people.
Yeah.
I want to like quote something from you say from your book, because I sort of really like this, and it's all to do with translation and the narration, because we don't want to ever make this sound derogatory, and we don't want to make women feel like their bodies are crap compared to men's, right? I mean, that's what it can often translate. When you say here, focusing on biologically based sex differences perpetuates the idea that there is something inherently defective and risky about women's bodies and their participation in sports. It can be particularly disempowering narrative, leaving girls and women in a seemingly helpless situation. And then you say, well, injuries will never be eliminated. When you talk about this in your chapter, you really encourage female-specific prevention strategies. And that's what we were talking about, like knowing that we potentially have these like bone health issues, ligament, tendon issues, and stuff like that. Like we need to do this in a really respectful way. Women are doing more sports than ever before. We don't want them to do that and then go, oh, by the way, it's all going to go pear-shaped for you, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, to your point too, right, about needing to reach this broader audience, I feel like in the comments that I've received and then the questions that I've received at like book events and stuff like that, you can tell, I mean, there's just such a hunger for information, right? And you can also tell like just the frustration to be like, I don't like, how do I, like, there's so much. How do I even figure this out? How do I even figure out what it means for me? Like, is it important that I pay attention to? Right. And I feel for everyone because it is so confusing. It is so convoluted. And the fact that, you know, we are still very early on in a lot of this research. Like, there's no, you know, gold standard yet. There's no like evidence-based guidelines or consensus and a lot of this stuff. So it is like kind of like working your way through a lot of muck, right? And trying to figure out what works best for you.
But that's something that you're good at, though. And I think that's what's so great about the book is you actually don't mind digging deep into the science for us, right?
Yeah, I'm trying to, right? It's I think it is still a challenge, though, even kind of reading my book and then figuring out, it's like, okay, what does that mean for me, right? I think that there are some heartening, maybe possibly like glimmers of hope in the sense that, you know, also to your point about like school-based education, I know in Washington, D.C. that they're starting a new like menstrual health curriculum that boys and girls, I believe, need to take. And it is like everything that I wish that I had that I think that these kids need to know, right, from a pretty early age about like, what is your menstrual cycle? What are those hormones? How do they affect your body outside of just reproduction and fertility? Because I think that the way that our society focuses so much on just reproduction, fertility, sex, you know, all of those things does such a disservice to our ability to actually talk about this stuff and to educate people. Personally, I think that that's one of the biggest pieces, right? That's holding a lot of this back.
Do they include menopause in that?
Yeah.
I wonder. Oh, absolutely. It's going in. I'm thinking
in the curriculum.
I doubt it.
I probably doubt it, but I wonder. But
I know in the UK now, it's in some of the school curriculum because there's been a campaign for it. And it doesn't need to be rocket science. It's like, this is the full reproductive life of a woman. And this is how it can impact her body, right? And it's just this bits of knowledge. We don't need to go often down into deep detail. It's just actually having an awareness. It can be part of it.
Absolutely.
One of the things I wanted to ask you about is, do you get frustrated when you see sort of like very binary conversations around, say, training around your cycle? This is as an example of one. So we're doing more research now, and it's so exciting to see that, you know, we're looking at like maybe more the athletic community about how working in the luteal phase compared to the follicular phase and how that can feel on a woman's body. And then maybe moving through into perimenopause and menopause, how we need to change the way we're exercising potentially to support our body in a better way. And so, but what I find with a lot of these conversations is you must not do strength training in your follicular phase. That's when you have to do HIIT training, and you can't do HIIT training. And I'm just like, why? Why are we talking about it in such absolute terms? Because if you've got the energy to do something, I say seize the day. And I wonder what your thought is on that. Do you find it a little bit binary, or do you think that's, again, translating from science speak into human speak that gets lost?
I absolutely do get frustrated by it. I think that I completely, again, understand the impulse, right? And both in terms of folks who are looking at this type of training, because we want answers, right? We want something to help us. We want something simple. And this, and then I get the impulse too to like make it as simple as possible because you can sell it too. So for me, I'm a little bit more cynical in the sense that I see it as people see this market opportunity, right? And they see this opportunity to pitch something and sell something that sure might have some potential, right? But like I said, we don't have a ton of information to back up a lot of these recommendations per se. So I'm a little bit more cynical in that. And I do want people to be more cautious consumers, if you will, or at least more critical consumers, right? And asking questions about this. Because again, like I understand, like, and I went through this too. I wanted to be like, if I just track my cycle, if I just look at it and then I'll figure out what's going on and then I'll, then I can just do X, Y, and Z and then it'll be great. And my fitness will improve, my performance, everything will feel great. But we're humans, right? We're super messy. There's no one thing that's going to work for every single person. But I think that there are the positive thing that I take out of the whole cycle syncing and training trend is that I do hope that it gets people to just pay attention to their bodies a little bit more, right? And I think if we even just do that, could be like a world of difference. Right.
The awareness of like what potentially may be. And I think you talk about like being your own like personal detective, right? Like when it comes to any phase. And it's not that you always have the answers. It's just that it might just be a bit of knowledge that you need to just go, oh, hang on, it might be that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And it's again, like this turning inwards and turning into what is going on in your body and how you're feeling. Because I also feel like, for a lot of women, and I know, or maybe just me, like for a lot of times, I have ignored a lot of these signals that my body's given me. I haven't always paid attention to it because I've always felt like I shouldn't, or I need to push through, or, like that's just me being, lazy or whatever.
Stubborn.
Or stubborn. Yeah. Or, all of these different things, right? But not actually paying attention to what my body is actually saying and like how I'm actually feeling, right? So I feel like that ability just to like tune into yourself is helpful so that you can, potentially identify trends, but maybe you won't. But even if you don't, you still like have a better sense of what your body actually feels like, what it's going through. Then you can also notice when things feel great and when things don't feel great, right? And you can adjust from there.
Yeah, perfect. And I like how you talked about like the energy availability being something that's super important, because I think as women we tend to really sort of use the sort of paradigm that's really should die of like, if we need to feel better, we need to exercise more and eat less. And it's one of the worst things I think women can do. And the idea of like not eating and not fueling for the movement that we're doing because of a fear of the way we're going to change our body's shape or something, I think is really harmful. I know that's something you're keen for women to move away from.
Absolutely. Because I feel like you're then stuck between a rock and a hard place, right? Because on the one hand, you either want your body to do all of this like sports stuff or at least just physically active stuff, but then you're not giving it the actual fuel it needs to support that activity. So you're basically asking the body, right, to like draw down on a checking account or a bank account that's got nothing there. And so of course you're going to get into like this deficit phase and your body's going to like not be able to perform, but then it's also is going to start like protecting its reserves. And so no, you're not going to end up losing like the weight that you want to, right? But like,
no,
it just creates so much more stress in the body that, has repercussions for everything, right? Like in terms of like long-term health and whatnot.
Yeah. And just also feeling like a dirty dish rag. It's just the worst. It's just the worst.
True.
So let's just go to your book. So was there anything that you found when you wrote the book that was completely new to you after writing about this for decades? Was there anything that you were just like, I had no idea about this, and it was like a light bulb moment?
That's a great question. I think there's two pieces. One was really around breast biomechanics in this and thinking about sports bras and how those are designed. Because yes, we know like we have to wear sports bras and whatnot, but like not recognizing, oh my gosh, how intricate our breasts are when they move, when we're being physically active, and like that movement isn't just up and down, right? Like we kind of joke about, but like it is like up and down and in and out and side to side. And it's really complicated. And it makes sense then why it's been so hard to develop sports bras that work. And it's because the science really hasn't been there, right? Researchers haven't really had the technology to be able to study the breast motion, as intricately as they might need until like basically 20 years ago, right? And so that's like no time at all. So that was really fascinating to me. And like all that goes into studying breast biomechanics. Like I wish that it wasn't COVID when I was reporting this. So like I could actually go and watch some of this stuff. And then the other piece, frankly, is like the perimenopause piece of it, largely because it is just such a black hole, right? Like we don't talk about it. There's not that much information about it. But in respect to that, it really was really trying to understand how and why menopause has gotten such a bad rap, right? Like why no one wants to talk about it and why, there seems to be no solutions, right? Or no strategies for women to help women, deal with all of these symptoms that we have, and why it's kind of just like, sorry.
To me, it's like similar to what we were talking about, the female triad, athlete triad. It's just that there are people that know, but they're either they don't have the platform or they can't amplify it, and it's just not getting down to the people that need it. That's the thing, right? So I think that's changing. I think that's evolved. Like I think between us and many of the other people that I using the platform, I think that it's a different conversation. I'm continually learning about that still, which is good because there's so many unanswered questions, right?
Absolutely.
But it is pretty. One of the things that I wanted to ask you about as well within the book is the disparity in sports between men and women, right? And you used the great example, which I remember about the NCAA basketball tournament of 2021, because I remember it coming up on social media. And this is just one example of it's just shocking, where there was this really, I'm calling them pink dumbbells. I'm pretty sure they weren't, but there was like an A-frame of like some 5 and 10 pound dumbbells. And the guys' gym was like this full like Gold's Gym setup rack, all the racks and everything. And these are two sets of extremely high-end like athletes, and they're treated so differently in their environments. And then when called out in it, the NCAA doubled down, right?
Yeah.
Doubled down. So can you tell me, like, I'd like you just to expand on that sort of story, and then just tell me why you think this is the case and what you'd like to see moving forward in, female athletic environment.
So after those, photos and videos of the quote unquote weight room in the women's NCAA tournament bubble went viral. Yeah, I don't think that the NCAA thought that there would be such a reaction. They thought that
they didn't think they'd done anything wrong.
No, they're like, well, there's no space. But then, there was another video that showed that there was plenty of space to build that out. But it was really it goes to show just a series of decisions throughout the planning of that tournament that kind of led to this position, right? So because it was COVID, planning kind of had to be put off. They were trying to figure out if they could actually do this. Of course, they were going to put on the men's tournament because that's their moneymaker, right? Like that's a big, revenue generator for the NCAA. But then the women's tournament, they actually had to put together, like the planning committee had to put together basically a proposal justifying why their tournament should go on. And so because of all of these other hoops that the women had to go through in the planning committee, their planning got pushed back. So they actually didn't have as much time to plan all of these things, right? To get things in place. But still, the NCAA, like the resources that they allocated them, from everything from like swag bags to the food that the athletes had to eat.
The food was
it was terrible. And even I think like the COVID tests that they were using too, like the men got like the PCRs every day or whatever. And the women, I think, got like, you know, the equivalent of like at-home tests or something. I'm not entirely positive about that, but there was some discrepancy there. There was also a discrepancy in terms of media. So for the men's and all of the rounds of the men's games, they had photos, right? And so when you are a journalist, you get access to basically like the equivalent of like a Google folder, right? Where they put all of these, you know, photos from all the games, and then you can pull from those to run with your articles. So for all of the men's game, they had all of these photos. But for the women's game, they weren't planning. They had less photographers, I think, approved, but then they were also not planning on providing as much media until like the round of 16 or something like that. So because there are no photos, it makes it, again, harder for like journalists and news publications to then cover those events, right? Because, you know, as a newspaper, you're not going to want to run old photos. So anyhow, it just creates all of these barriers that they didn't even think about. So, but it just reflects this sentiment that I think the NCAA has, and, you know, subsequent investigation kind of proved to be true, that they just thought that the women's tournament and frankly, women's side of the sport, as an afterthought, right? That this idea and this attitude that, well, women should just be happy. You should just be happy that you have a chance to play. Yeah, it wasn't important.
And I think you talk about the numbers. There's like an actual, you can quantify it, right? In 2019, they spent $35 million more on the men's tournament than the women's.
Yeah. And it's wild, right? And the women also I didn't know this, the women couldn't use the branding of March Madness. So March Madness is this huge brand, right? But the women's tournament could not use that and couldn't capitalize on that brand identity and brand recognition. So again, it's all of these barriers that are placed in front of women that you have to navigate around and try to work your way around. And then when the women's games either, you know, don't draw as many viewers, or, you know, not as many people on television are talking about, or, you know, watching, or, you know, newspapers aren't writing about it, they then blame, right, the women's sports. You're like, why aren't you doing better? Like, you don't deserve it because you're not doing better in these realms. And it's like, well, we can't do better because you're literally putting all of these like barriers in our way to like, yeah, exactly.
But
like
then when they open those barriers, we see it hugely successful, right? Because there's been opportunities that we've seen in women's soccer, for example, right? How the crowds were selling out. It was amazing, right?
Absolutely.
And so,
And even this past year, so this March, the tournament, so women could use the March Madness branding now. But this past tournament, the women's final drew in like 10 million viewers, which was like a huge jump in viewership. And it was because like you could actually watch the game.
If they allowed us to do it. Yeah.
Yeah. I can't remember. I think it was like actually aired on ESPN. So it like you could actually flip through the TV, right? And watch something. Cause how many times have you like, you know, gone through the channels and it's all like men's golf, like race cars, like men's golf, like, you know, old reruns of like baseball games and stuff like that. But you never see women's games there. Cause like if it was there, I would stop and watch it.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And so how do you see this evolving moving forward? Do you think it will improve?
I do. Like, I feel like we are at this like really cusp of a moment, right? Like for me, I feel like we started to see a lot more momentum following the 2019 World Cup and, you know, the US women winning that title. But I feel like we are at this moment where women's sports really is building momentum. We see like across, not just in the US, but across the world, we see viewership numbers, attendance numbers, all breaking records, right? Like I know in the UK too, like the women's soccer matches or football matches, they've drawn in, you know, so many tens of thousands of, you know, of fans to these games.
And then because of that branding and recognition and sponsorship, right?
Yeah, we start to see more brands and sponsors coming on board. And I think more importantly, too, you see like these younger girls too becoming fans, and you're developing that fandom from a young age, and they're going to be the fans in the future. And that's what we really want. So I'm really excited actually to see, with the World Cup coming up, later this month, kind of how all of that plays out. Because I think they're estimating like 1 billion viewers or something like that for the tournament, which is phenomenal.
Yeah, and I'm so excited by it. And I don't know if you watch the Ryan Reynolds Wrexham.
Oh yes.
So he's now invested into the women's team, and of course they're going to do well if you've got all of those millions behind it. But the fact is, though, it just is creating that platform and elevating the sport even more. I mean, I remember a time when I was in school in the UK, we didn't play football, and we didn't play rugby, right? You only could do hockey or netball. It was like, and so, I mean, all of that sort of course changed now, right? And there's, girls have got opportunity to do anything they want, but it also means that they need to be supported through every element of it. And, when I remember the US women's soccer 4 years ago, they were complaining about getting changed in porta cabins, and where there was no showers and there was nowhere for them to get changed, and they were having to do it on the side of the field. And so I hope that changes too.
Yeah.
Okay. So just to sort of like finish off, do you have any sort of words of wisdom I'm talking maybe outside of like the athletic world, but women who want to exercise, women who feel like there's a ton of information out there and it's maybe just too much and they feel overwhelmed by it. How do they get started? What do they need to look for in like exercise? Something that they can sustain.
I mean, that's totally me.
That's totally me as
well. And there is so much information to try to sort through. And I think that for me, it's really focusing in on like one thing at a time, right? Like it's really hard and very overwhelming to try to overhaul everything all at once. And it's almost like you're setting yourself up, right, to fail if you're trying to change all of these different things. So it's like focusing on one thing. And so for me right now, especially with my current knee injury, my focus really is around getting stronger and building strength, right? So yes, I'm still doing, what I can in terms of like cardiovascular fitness stuff, like riding, which is essentially like riding a stationary bike, which is so fun. But,
right.
But, aside from doing that, but it is like, then, my focus right now really is, working on strength. So making sure that I am, aside from doing my like physical therapy stuff, I am getting into the gym and lifting weights like 2 to 3 times a week. Right. And then really thinking about being consistent in that realm, but also then thinking about like, more specifically on what kind of stimulus I need in that environment. So again, as someone who is 47, who is, I'm assuming in perimenopause, somewhere in that stage, because who knows really where one is at any time. That also means like, I do have to lift heavier weights, right? And I do need to have that stimulus for my body. Because I do see like, it does feel like my muscles are like shrinking before my eyes, right? In a lot of ways. So for me, like that is it. Like it's focusing on like one thing, initially kind of building up the consistency, building up, something that I feel confident in and can see myself progress, because that's also important.
We need to win, don't we? We
do need the win. But then I also go back to, I remember from our conversation when we talked and you talking to me about like, I think you called like fitness snacking, right? Like, and just kind of also calibrating my expectations too, because understanding that I'm not going to feel out of 10 every single day, despite what I want to, but really just trying to think, okay, even if it's 10, 15 minutes, I'm going to do like a couple rounds. I'm going to see how I feel then. Inevitably, I feel better once I get started. But it is that like that initial kind of like almost like activation energy, right? Like to get there and start doing the stuff that's really hard versus if I have in my mind, I'm like, oh my God, I'm going to do this like killer workout. Like I just, do all of these different things. Inevitably, when I step into the gym, I do like 1 or 2 rounds and I'm like, okay, I'm done. I don't want to do this anymore.
I love the way you say that calibrate your expectations. It's exactly that, right? And it's okay to change your mind. Right?
Yeah,
it's okay.
Absolutely. Yeah. And thinking about even just in terms of intensity too, right? Instead of if it is, say, for strength training, thinking about like in strict terms of weight that I'm lifting, so some days I might feel great, some days I don't, right? But that I can work at the same intensity, but that might mean I'm using different weights on those days, if that makes sense. So days I feel great, I'm lifting heavier weights. Days I feel like less great, I'm lifting, less heavy weights, but I'm working at the same intensity as I would have, on a good day.
Yeah, and that's why fitness looks different for everyone, right? That's why it's very unique, and you've got to, again, work out your own like personal, like be your own detective again, right?
Yeah.
That's really great advice. Okay, so Christine, where can we find you? Where can we pick the book up? What's the best place to seek you out?
Yeah, so the book is available wherever books are sold. So it's right now in hardcover. There's an audiobook and there's an ebook as well. And then I am on social media at CYU888 on Instagram and Twitter until Twitter disintegrates.
It's imploding. Should we leave?
Exactly. And then I also have a Substack, which is, I believe, christineu.substack.com.
Awesome. Well, I will make sure that people get all of that information, and definitely go and pick up the book if you're someone who is a female and likes to move. It's really interesting, and I promise you I'll finish that and write you a lovely review.
Thank you so much.
Thank you for including me in that, Christine.
Oh my goodness. You've been such a help and inspiration, I think, definitely personally for me as I'm like approaching this, but I very much appreciate you sharing your story with me too, because the book wouldn't exist without folks like yourself who are willing to share this stuff. Yeah. Otherwise it would be a physiology textbook.
Well, that's what makes it relatable, right? We need those anecdotal stories to like hinge it together. So well, thank you for coming on the show. I very much appreciate it, and best of luck with the book.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for listening to the show. If you like what you hear, then why not subscribe to this podcast and leave me a review? You see, when you do this, it helps to raise the profile of my show and attract new listeners. And it also allows me to continue to deliver valuable content with great guests. And in return for you doing that, I will send you my 12-week core-focused program called Abs on Fire as a thank you. Simply drop me an email at amanda@amandathebe.com and I'll wing that your way. Bye.